Hello and welcome. You're watching Business Plus. GST, India's single biggest tax reform, is on a firm path and appears to have overcome its teething problems. If March monthly collection for goods and services tax GST is anything to go by, the GST collections for the month of March have come at an all-time high of 1.87 lakh crore. Now, March generally sees a higher tax collection because it's the last month of the fiscal year. However, the GST collection in the last quarter of 22-23 has been around 1.55 lakh crore, which is very close to the estimates. So while GST continues to impress, there are also issues that need resolution, including but not limited to complexity of regulations, frequent changes, difficulty in filing returns, and challenges in claiming input tax credit. On the show today, all you need to know about the GST journey so far, the success and issues with compliances. Joining us at this point in time with me is Subhash Chandra Garg, who is the former Finance and Economic Affairs Secretary. Also with us at this point in time is Sushil Kumar Modi, member of Rajya Sabha and former Chief of Empowered Committee on GST. Hetal Gandhi, who is the Director of CRISIL, is also with us. In the studio with me, Rakesh, Khar, who is the Editor for Business and Economy at TV9 Network. Before we move on, please don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to TV9. Before I come to any of my guests, external guests, let me talk to my in-house expert and understand from you, Rakesh, how's the journey of GST been so far? Almost 6 years since GST was implemented in a midnight session. I happened to cover it, but it's come a long way since then.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll just keep it very short because we have an eminent panel waiting to, give their expert view. So I'm really looking forward to hearing them out. But frankly, having been looking at the business and economy space for the last almost 3.5 decades, I do believe that this is the second most important economic reform that we have done. 1991 reforms, all of us know. So, 2017 is this big ticket indirect tax reform, which has actually changed the entire economic landscape in this country. I do believe that if 1991 reforms brought about a certain consensus across the polity in India about, opening up the economy to global investors and opening ourselves to competition, GST has enabled that reform, and it's been born out of broad political consensus. We do have severe challenges right now, but it doesn't dim in any way the huge success that we have achieved by actually getting it off the ground, and now we're in the 6th year. Okay. There are challenges. The big ticket problem is that we are into an election year. Since there are issues between states and the center in the GST Council, which is emerging as a big story in terms of the track forward for GST. How does it pan out in the election year? Do we actually see big ticket reforms going forward? Like any great idea, 1991 reforms and 2017, all big ideas need recalibration over a period of time. Is this the right time? Will we have to wait till 2024 results and then get into the big bang ticket reforms? Or the next meeting in June will actually shed some big light on the reforms ahead. Okay. So we can begin with our experts.
Absolutely. Let me come to Mr. Sushil Kumar Modi at this point in time. Sir, I want to understand from you, how's the GST journey looking like so far? We talked about some of the teething problems that we've now been able to overcome. It's almost 6 years, but it's also just a year ahead of the elections. What sort of big changes are we going to see in the June Council meeting of GST?
So I don't feel that a big ticket reform is going to happen before the elections. But the leakages are getting plugged. Teething issues has been addressed. Most of the teething issues have been addressed. But for the next phase of reforms, we have to wait till elections. Because still inflation rates are high, and so no state would like to increase the tax rates or the inverted duty structure or making any other tweaking the rates in GST. Mm-hmm. So you don't expect much reforms in the coming 1 year. And I think that after only the Lok Sabha elections, some major next set of reforms can take place in GST. But the last 6 years of journey is very successful journey. Those who in the beginning people thought that it is going to fail, and in the beginning there was a lot of teething problems, and especially the small taxpayers, the traders who were not very acquainted with the GST network. They were not tax savvy. They were having teething problems in the beginning. But I must thank Arun Jaitley and must thank the GST Council that in each and every meeting, they have taken decisions, and they made changes. Though there was some criticism from some economists and some other people, but that those changes were required. And now the system has stabilized. People are used to GST, and now I don't find many big issues in GST as on today.
Okay. Mr. Garg, do you agree with that assessment? Not many big issues at this point in time. And before we go to the nitty-gritties, I want to get your overall picture of how the last almost 6 years been for GST since its implementation.
See, undoubtedly, GST was a big reform of taxation system. It also impacted the economic performance as well, though it was not as wide-ranging reform as was done in 1991 in terms of trade, industrial licensing, and many other foreign investment and other things. But in itself, in taxation of the government, this was definitely a very big reforms. Now, the reform is working out well in last 6 years. A lot of issues have been sorted out, but we must always remember that the indirect taxation reform culminating in GST at this stage is a story which actually is there for last 25-30 years. First time in 1986, when VAT was modified, VAT was introduced, was the beginning when to make the indirect taxation system value-added tax based. Even today, there is a lot of issues remaining. Petroleum, electricity, and many of these products are outside GST. We also have a very large number of producers outside the GST by providing them exemptions from registration or compounded taxation. There are issues connected with the GST rates. There are also issues connected with the compensations tax, compensation cess and other things. So this journey must continue, but I entirely agree with Mr. Modi that perhaps the next steps in the GST reforms or the indirect taxation reforms will perhaps not be taken in the next 1 year. There is also a certain kind of disconnect and disharmony between the center and the states, which is also sort of precluding the building up of the necessary consensus, which Arun Jaitley so fabulously built it and made it happen. But thereafter, there has been some sort of adversarial kind of view which has immersed in the GST Council and things like. I think we'll have to sort that out, bring the consensus mechanism back, and wait for the elections, Lok Sabha elections, for the next step to be taken.
Okay. Now, before I go to Hetal, a quick response from you, Mr. Modi, at this point in time. Do you see an adversarial sort of, relationship between various members of the GST Council, which is essentially various finance ministers of various states? And do you see that hampering the functioning of GST Council meetings? We are hearing about fault lines appearing. Would you agree with that assessment?
In fact, if I can add,
no, I don't agree. See,
okay.
It is very difficult to match a personality like Arun Jaitley.
Absolutely.
So if you compare anybody with Arun Jaitley, then it is very difficult. But till 18 months back, I was in the GST Council when I was the Finance Minister of Bihar, and I've attended more than half of the meeting with Nirmala Sitharaman. She is also doing very well. And see, earlier also there were some here and there were some issues, some problem, and the states were not agreeable to many of the things. And so I don't think, because see, 80-90% of the problem were solved during Arun Jaitley's regime. And now very little things have left to be solved. But this is true that every month or every time you go on making some changes or going for some reforms. But the main period was in the beginning 2 years, 2.5 years. That was the most challenging part during making the law, making the act, and all other things. So those issues were resolved during Arun Jaitley's lifetime itself. So, but I think it will not be good to compare Arun Jaitley with any other person. But I can say that I have seen Nirmala Sitharaman. She is doing very well, and she has taken over the GST Council in a very well manner.
Mr. Modi, the challenge is that, of course, nobody is trying to, dilute the kind of contribution that Mr. Jaitley made, and of course, you also made as the Empowered Committee Chief. But the fault lines are quite visible now. In fact, Dr. Amit Mitra, the finance minister or the finance advisor now to the West Bengal government, has gone on record to say that the opposition ruled states are being shortchanged. He in fact has put a timeline to it. He's rightly pointing out that until 3 years of the GST, it was working well, and now in the last few months, more so, if not couple of years, the tension between the inside the GST Council is heightened, with opposition rule parties probably, the accusation is that they fear being shortchanged. Is this fear genuine, and what is giving rise to this fear? Is it just political upmanship, or there are actually issues on the ground where states and the federal play looks like they're being shortchanged on the revenue accruals?
So I think all these are politics. Say either it is Amit Mitra or anybody else issuing a statement outside GST Council is one thing, and within the GST Council, they've never raised such issues. See, last year when the tax rates were revised for the for many curd and some other items, food grains and other, nobody opposed in the GST Council. And each and every state implemented, but every state of the opposition rule states, they were issuing statements against the central government. So this is not true for public consumption, for political reason, writing letters, raising some issues, and raising issues inside the GST Council. But I have seen that the atmosphere is very cordial inside the GST Council. There may be a difference of opinion. They raise the issue, but ultimately everybody agrees with whatever decision is being taken. So
political consensus, Mr. Modi, political consensus defined GST as a grand success. This having one view inside the room and having another outside, which is for public consumption, doesn't it look like that politics is out to derail? And if everybody is invested equally into the GST Council, which includes state's finance minister, what compels them to go to the to the media or to speak outside of the council and say something else? Obviously, there are challenges at hand. What are those challenges?
No, because when the tax rates were increased on some items, food grains, so because people didn't take it sportingly, so they had to issue a statement. Even Kerala issued a statement. Tamil Nadu was issuing a statement. But why they never opposed those tax increase in the GST Council? And they were the states who implemented it immediately. So I've seen even Rahul Gandhi saying that it is a Gabbar Singh tax, and when the Congress will come into power, they will overhaul the GST. But not a single Congress minister has ever used this word that it is a Gabbar Singh tax or it is against the public. No Congress ruled states finance minister has ever raised such issues in GST Council. So raising issues outside Council is one thing, and behaving inside the GST Council is another thing. So I don't find there is big problem in GST Council.
Okay.
Things are going on very well. So I don't find much problem in GST Council.
Okay, let me bring in Hetal at this point in time, and let's go through the numbers, because the numbers are telling an interesting trend. GST monthly collection consistently breached 1.4 lakh crore mark throughout the financial year gone by. Higher mop-up in theory means there's larger consumption of goods and services within the country, which is a good indicator. However, some would say that inflation and a baseline effect has somewhat muddled with this trend. Would you agree with that, Hetal?
Yeah, so we track the GST data pretty regularly, and if you exclude the first year of launch, where the collection was only for X number of months, and you calculate a CAGR of GST collections from FY19 to FY23, what you will see is that there is a more than 10% increase in GST collections that has happened, or close to around 11%. And if you look at revenue growth rate, which takes into account everything, commodity price cycles, the downturn of COVID and the increase or the recovery after that, you will see that the CAGR for large companies which are listed on the stock exchange and account for more than 50% of the market cap, there the revenue growth rate CAGR was around 9%, which means you are collecting almost 200 basis points higher tax rate as compared to what is the revenue growth of the larger players. Now, this is a combination of multiple things. You did inclusion of certain products within the GST basket. So there has been escalation of coverage that has happened over a period of time. Plus, of course, there has been, increase in transparency and more number of registered users that have come in play. So combination of this has resulted into definitely GST collections being, higher as compared to typical revenue growth that you will see for corporate India. So that is clearly a very, very positive sign. I think what remains to be seen is how the exclusion list is brought under the purview. So you have some agri items which continue to remain at 0%. And you have, more importantly, categories like alcohol, petroleum products that remain out. Reforms in that space will be watched out for to bring in a single tax regime, if I have to say so, for corporate India.
Mr. Garg, we discussed, the so to say, the politicization of the GST Council. Politics apart, do you see any merit in, opposition ruled states getting extremely uncomfortable, increasingly uncomfortable actually, with the way the council is functioning and with the decisions are taken? Is there some merit in their argument? And how do we mitigate this going forward? I mean, we do know that reforms are going to wait for one more year, but the council itself and the sanctity of the entire idea rests on consensus. Do you see that as a challenge?
Before I respond to this question, let me just say a little bit on what Hetal was also saying, just to bring the reality of the trend. This is very true. The GST growth in last 2 years has been very spectacular. But if you look at last 4 years kind of GST collections, you would notice that first 2 years, that is 1920 and 2021, were actually quite a bit of come down. In 1920, we grew only by less than 4%, and 2021 happened to be a negative growth year. So 2 years were quite bad, but last 2 years have been very spectacular. 38% growth or 28% growth in 21-22, and about 22% growth in last year. So that has made up more than what the performance of GST until 2021 was. And one more point I think we should not miss. There are two elements which explain much of the buoyancy in last 2 years. One is the inflation and the second is import. So IGST on import has been growing very massively, but with the imports sliding down from sometime in September last year, in fact, in March, the imports declined in absolute terms. So the contribution of imports in IGST is now turning to be somewhat of a matter of concern. And if you exclude the IGST on import for last 3 years, the growth rate of GST is only about 1.1 buoyancy of the GDP growth. And this month, April growth is about 11.5% over last April. So what I see with inflation coming under control, especially the wholesale inflation, to which this day the GST performance is more related than the retail inflation, and import coming down, my sense is that the 23-24 would be a much less spectacular, maybe more lackluster kind of growth in GST. maybe around 10% or even less unless the economic growth picks up. So that is something we should watch rather than rejoice over the performance of last 2 years. Now to come back to your question on the political side, I don't think we need to go into political. And my sense about GST, the equation or the relationship between the center and the states, it's not confined to GST. You see a wider trend of literally fiscal unionism taking over the fiscal federalism in a way. The way the excise duties have been handled virtually, the all states have been deprived of any part in the excise duty collections by shifting more and more to the cesses side and the surcharges. That's also happening on the customs duty now. You look at the way the mining royalties and other things have been handled. So there is a wider issue of the relationship between the center and the states, which gets more pronounced in the case of opposition states. Because opposition states do suffer and they can articulate, whereas the BJP states may not be in a position to openly articulate, even though they might actually be feeling the impact of that. So I see that trend becoming sharper and more transient in times to come as we head to the election, which will, to my mind, sort of clear the pitch for the GST reforms or any other fiscal federal reforms for next 1 year at least. Let's see what happens after that.
Mr. Modi, do you see these numbers holding? Mr. Garg obviously is laying out a prescription where he's, he is being realistic in saying that we may not be able to sustain the momentum in the current fiscal. How do you look at these numbers? I mean, there's one view that we could hit a 2 trillion a month and probably, go ahead and, maintain that tempo. What, according to your estimation, you've been inside and outside both, do the numbers look like as we go forward?
I'm not an expert like Mr. Garg. So I would not like to contradict what he said, that I don't know the nitty-gritty of the economy and many other things.
So you've been following the trajectory in that sense.
But now, say, this is the election year. So during the election year, I think the revenue will be affected. So, and the inflation is coming down. I don't know how much the inflation impacts the revenue collection in 10% or 12, 13%. But as the inflation is coming down, so that may also hit but the biggest challenge is to plug the leakages. That is the biggest challenge. And only about 5-6 days back, Srimati Nirmala Sitharaman, there was a statement, returns of scrutiny system automated. So this is very important. So if the states or the union government want to increase their revenue collection in GST, they have to plug the leakages, and especially the registration-linked fraud. Registration-linked fraud. And the bigger the state, the more advanced state, more fraud taking place in those states. I have a data in Maharashtra in the last 5 years, 60,000 crore fraud has taken place. Karnataka 40,000 crore, Gujarat 26,000 crore, Rajasthan 19,000 crore. So these frauds or fake invoicing, this is a major challenge. And if they are able to contain this fake billing and registration linked fraud, so then I think they will be able to sustain this revenue collection. So even though the economy may not be growing in that way, but if they are able to plug the leakages, then they can sustain the revenue growth.
Okay. Hetal, do the numbers hold up? The numbers that have been laid down by Mr. Garg hold up for you? And also wanted to understand from you, you mentioned inflation. Inflation, of course, has an impact on GST collection. What sort of hit on revenue or an uptick in revenue have we seen as a result of inflation? And if the inflation does come down in months to come and up till the next year, what sort of impact would that likely have on GST collections?
Yeah, so I think the super commodity cycle that began immediately after COVID, we are seeing that across most commodities, prices are expected to come down in fiscal 24. And in fact, in line with what Mr. Garg said, corporate India revenue growth is also expected to be in the range of 10 to 12%. If you look at the April collections and what is expected even in the budget, is a range which is lower growth rate as compared to what has happened until now. So I would tend to agree that you should expect a 10 to 12% kind of a range. But looking at the past momentum, we would definitely believe that you will continue to see GST grow a tad more or a little higher than what would be the nominal corporate India growth rate.
Okay.
Interesting. So I think by and large the trajectory would be maintained, factoring in inflation and But Mr. Garg mentioned this fiscal federalism. We need to understand from him and Mr. Modi both, fiscal federalism in an election year and then reform or the need to do reform or the mandate to do reform going forward in GST has to be seen in context of the other imperative. With the highest court also bringing in a certain observation on the functioning of the GST Council, where it says that the recommendations these are recommendations and they're not mandatory for the states or the center, their legislatures to pass. So the entire idea of GST Council, my question to both the esteemed panelists is that how do you see GST, the architecture of GST with this council being the operating instrument to bring about this change, shaping up in the next few months and probably couple of years? To you, Mr. Modi, first.
I say, I think it was the Minerva mineral case.
That's right. That's right.
Yes. In which case but there was nothing new. The Supreme Court has reiterated what is already there in the GST Act or the GST law. And see, the GST law has been framed in such a manner that to whatever extent they may be opposing inside the GST Council, but no state will deviate. If suppose Tamil Nadu is a chronic case here. I've seen Tamil Nadu, either the UP government at the center or the NDA government, they always oppose each and everything that takes place inside the GST Council. But if suppose the Tamil Nadu, if they increase the taxes, it will become inconvenient for the other states to do business with Tamil Nadu. So no state is going to deviate from whatever decision is being taken in the GST Council, because Mr. Garg will be able to brief it in more detail, because the Act of each and every state says that the recommendation of GST Council will be implemented in that state. The Act itself of Tamil Nadu or Bihar or any other state, it says like this. It has been worded in this manner. So no state will deviate. And if any state deviate or go out of GST, no other state will do business with that particular state. And then another thing is GST network. The GST network, GSTN, it is for the entire country. And if you go outside or if you deviate, so it will be very difficult for that state to survive. So what in the mineral case, they have reiterated what is already defined in the GST Act or GST law. So I don't think anybody will deviate from the GST Council decision. And see, in the last 6 years, there was only on one occasion there is a voting in the GST Council, and that was also on the issue of lottery. And the Kerala insisted, though they knew that no state is going to support them, only hardly 2 or 3 states supported them, Kerala. But if you spare this one incident, in the last 6 years, all the decisions the GST Council has been taken, unanimous decision has been taken in the GST Council.
Mr. Garg, on growing fiscal federalism, as you rightly pointed out, and in the highest court's observations, how do you look at? Do you share the optimism that Mr. Modi has, or we have to re-examine the entire framework, not just from the reform perspective, but also from buying peace between various constituents who are supposedly invested equally in the idea called GST?
See, the GST, and Mr. Modi knows it very well, was a compromise where states and the center pooled their sovereignty but constitutionally still they retain the sovereign power to do the SGST for the states and CGST for the center. Still constitutionally the states are sovereign for that. But this big construct which was in compromise which was struck was that we will always now henceforward work together in the GST Council and arrive at decisions which are harmonious, and we'll implement it together. That understanding is very tenuous understanding, but in practical terms, a very much like what Mr. Modi said, that no state will find it so advantageous to break that it outweighs the disadvantages. So I also see that no state is likely to move away from the GST consensus mechanism, but legally it remains competent to do it, and that if ever any state thinks of resorting to that kind of exercise of power will depend if the frustration they feel becomes too large for them to see that the advantage or the of moving away from the consensus outweighs the disadvantages. I'll give you a different example where see, the states have sovereign powers to borrow constitutionally. There is a fix in the constitution which says that if you are indebted to the center, then you cannot borrow without the approval or without the consent of the center. And since after independence, we worked on a system where all states become indebted to the center. Today, everyone believes and everyone understands that your power to borrow, your sovereign power to borrow doesn't really exist practically. However, that led to very bad consequences, and 2002, 3 and 3, 4, 4, 5, Mr. Modi would again also recall this, a lot of initiative was taken by the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government and followed by the Manmohan Singh government, and the states were virtually relieved of the loans from the central government. And by the 2017, 2018, the states were virtually on the verge of becoming fiscally independent in terms of borrowing, because their borrowings from the center or debt had come down to very small levels, about 75,000 crores. But the government of India introduced in 2021 this capex loan scheme. Now, capex loan schemes is advantageous to the states in terms of what it gives you without interest and for 50 years or something, but it also subjects you to a constant and continuous for 50 years subject to the central government approvals. And it also subjects you to very large number of conditions which you are not quite comfortable. That's the reason some states have not taken the capex loans still, and others have taken it unwillingly. So I think that kind of situation is unlikely to arise and must not arise in case we want our fiscal federalism to remain healthy. But if someday that kind of situation arises, I don't think it would not be that no state will cast the first stone.
Right. Okay, Rakesh, it looks like with all the challenges that are persisting, and from what our experts here are saying, that nothing much will move in the next 1 year until, of course, after election finishes. So we're not going to see much changes. The next GST Council meeting is expected in June. That would be nearly when GST completes 6 years of its existence. But not much changes are expected for the next 1 year.
At the macro level, it looks like that we wouldn't have much of changes, as our esteemed panelists have repeatedly pointed out, because this is the election year, and at present, unfortunately or fortunately, the bone of contention is the state's view and centre's view, and within that the opposition ruled state's view. So that's, so to say, dominating the discourse.
Right.
But to my mind, like Dr. Amit Mitra has written repeatedly to the GST Council, there are so many changes happening.
Right.
And repeatedly, as someone who's from the outside looking at the GST architecture, probably this all could change. Like in one of his latest letters written in January, he saw, rates of 419 items in goods and 19 categories were changed in last 5 years. Similarly, there are about 741 notifications, out of the 395 were central tax notifications, and central tax rate notifications about 148. So obviously, if the big idea is to bring about ease of efficiency in the entire ecosystem, have we been able to meet that? One nation, one tax, one market. Is it delivering that big promise?
Okay.
My submission, is that over the next 1 year, if we can't bring about a change in the big 5 tax structures, 0 to 28%, because that will call for a lot of deliberation. There are going to be, conflicting interests between states and the center.
Absolutely.
But in terms of the ease and efficiency, I think we could ask our panelists. My submission, and as a citizen, I think the expectation of both someone, an MSME, or someone who is involved and engaged with the GST, it impacts us directly or indirectly in many ways.
Absolutely.
Can that change be brought about? Can there be some unanimity and consensus on making the entire architecture look far more friendly, far more efficient? We brought about the technology through GST, and but there are glitches still yet, persisting.
A lot of pain points exist.
Absolutely. Mr. Modi, you think we could look at, if we were to draw the agenda for the next 3 to 6 months, what would be on your plate? And similarly, my question to Mr. Garg as well, so that we could educate our viewers on possibilities of having a better road ahead for GST and its operational metrics.
Many of the tax experts or the economists, they always say that there should be one tax rate. It is not feasible in India. Even the European Union, Mr. Garg must be knowing, even in the European Union, France and other countries, there are 3-4 tax rates. So, but if the GST Council, if they agree, and they can agree, but I don't think in the coming 6 or 8 months that these 4 or 5 rates, they can be readjusted to 3 rates. The slabs can be reduced. Then the number 2 is regarding petroleum products. There is always a hue and cry when there is an increase in the price of the petrol and diesel, that petrol and petroleum products should be bring under GST. I don't think this is feasible also, because the highest tax rate is only 28%. It means 14% for the state and 14% for the union government. And as on today, the tax rate on petrol products is more than 60, 70, 80%. So there will be a huge revenue loss to the states and the union government. More than 4 lakh crore of revenue loss will be there if the petroleum products are not under GST. Though they are under GST, still they are under GST. But you can't provide for input tax credit and these things. So these are the major reforms that will require much more. But the minor here, the online gaming is there. There is an issue in the agenda. Then regarding this registration linked fraud, inverted duty structure, these are some of the minor things, small things that can be tweaked here and there. But and I personally feel that a major overhaul is not required in the GST architecture. GST architecture is very good, but there can be here and there some minor tweaks only.
Okay. Let me get in Mr. Garg at this point in time. Mr. Garg, minor issues there, but have sort of a substantial impact on many industries. For example, online gaming. There is, of course, a call to increase the GST from 18% to 28%. An interesting point mentioned there by Mr. Modi is that you cannot really have uniform taxation. You cannot be taxing sugar or, let's say, cigarette at the same price. So a lot of minor such issues which all in all have a larger impact, and people of course are hoping and waiting for some more clarity.
See, on these 2 points, basically on the rates question, I entirely agree. We can't have a single rate structure, but we have too many at this moment. And if we can bring it to 2 or 3, that would be perhaps much better. On the question of the petroleum taxes and also property and the electricity duty, etc., it's a fact that the petroleum taxes suffer about 100% of the total incidence of taxes. You can't accommodate it in 28 or something. But there is a way out. I think there is a larger gain if we bring it into the GST, at the same time protecting the center and the state's revenue. because that's a very different question. And it can be done by way of excise duties or whatever. There are solutions, but we should think. I don't think those are the issues which are going to be handled in the next 1 year, and therefore these are major issues, minor, not minor issues in my judgment. But the inability to even bring in a taxation regime on online games and all is quite unfortunate. We have reformed our direct access mechanism for the online gaming, but for the indirect access, we have not been able to do it. I don't know why should we not be able to do it, and it's a, by the way, an area which is emerging in future. More than the goods, the services will yield taxes, and the services which provide people the entertainment and the services to kill time, which can be priced very well. Those are the areas where the buoyancy of growth will be much more. I think we should have solved this. It's a simple construct in my judgment. We should keep on quibbling over game of skill, game of etc. etc. Have a tax define properly the skill and non-skill, and have a tax of 18% on skill and 28% on non-skill. Sort this out. Without that, the confusion should. What I see, and which perhaps you were probably hinting at, there are a large number of issues, mostly connected with what has been said earlier, because there was a notable tendency to generate fake GST invoices, do input credit frauds and those kind of things, and that is leading, which I see the government becoming more and more caesareal tightening is being done, and that is creating a lot of complications for the honest taxpayers. And likewise, the exercise of powers for seizure, arrest, and other things are also giving sleepless nights to a lot of people. I know it's difficult to strike a very fine balance between the ability of the government to track and catch the culprit and provide the convenience to the others. But that is where the challenge lies. I think if we can address these issues, we should be at least try to do this in the next couple of months. But again, the track record, unfortunately, is not that we're not able to move much ahead even on these issues in last couple of months.
Mr. Garg, I absolutely agree with you that we do need to bring about these operational efficiencies and also bring a human face to the entire architecture. Mr. Modi, I do know that, and we do believe now that we wouldn't have many big ticket reforms before the elections are over. But ideologically, if one may understand, we come from a purely, essentially a socialist backdrop. So that also explains and reflects in our taxation structure, where cars are taxed in a much bigger bracket. But increasingly, like Mr. Garg said, services economy is leading the India growth story, and there is demand from manufacturers in the car industry who align it to it being one of the biggest drivers for the economic growth, both in terms of employment and also with improved highways leading to a multiplier economy. So do you see some kind of a rethink at the fundamental level or at the ideological level whenever we do the next set of slabs, and the rate structure, we will be a little more confident ourselves and then bring about taxation in a manner where they are linked to larger economic growth rather than a socialistic perspective or an architecture or a nomenclature which they are easily identified with, like cars are luxury, which may or may not be necessarily the case as the economy is growing and it has an aspiration to grow further.
See, the taxes on the utility vehicles or the cars, it is because of the compensation cess. Over and above GST of 28%, on some items like coal, air-cooled drinks, pan masala, luxury cars, there is a compensation cess, which is over and above 28%.
That's right. Syntax.
So, yes, syntax, and that is for compensation to the states. And I remember that compensation cess has been extended until March 2026. So I think after March 2026, when this compensation cess will not be there, at that time, the tax rates on the vehicles will come down. But prior to 2026, because the government of India has taken a huge loan to compensate to the states, and that loan can be repaid only by this compensation cess. So even if the government of India or the states want to reduce the tax rates on the utility vehicles or on the hotels or other things, it is not feasible because then they will incur huge loss. So I think it will take another 2 years. Then when the compensation cess will phase out, then naturally the tax rates on the vehicles will come down.
Okay.
And see, the GST has nothing to do with any ideology. So neither socialism or BJPism or anything else.
No, the
So
original thought
economic
comes from
reforms
that.
have nothing to do with any ideology.
Interesting.
Okay. Mr. Sushil Kumar Modi, member of Rajya Sabha, former Chief of Empowered Committee on GST. Appreciate you, sir, for taking your time out and for speaking to us on that very important issue. Hetal is back with us. Hetal, you talked about an exclusion list, and the exclusion list that excludes petroleum products, alcoholic drinks, electricity. We also briefly touched in your absence about rationalization of tax slabs, the number of tax slabs that need to be narrowed down to a couple of few as opposed to having 4 or 5 of them. What, in your understanding, are the operational efficiencies that need to come into GST to make it more compliance friendly and make it easier for people to file GST?
Yeah, I think apart from what you mentioned, the reforms which generally get spoken about from a GST standpoint also speaks about B2C tax slabs being decided. So here, what we need to do is have a very clear understanding of sectors where today input tax credit cannot be taken because there are certain commodities or products which are on excise at the end product level, and the inputs which are flowing into those value chains basically are paying GST. If we take a very simple example of sugar, ethanol, and then blending of ethanol that is happening in petrol, the tax regimes which are being followed are different, and it becomes very difficult to manage that at a value chain level. If at least these commodities where complexity levels are higher from a value chain perspective are identified, and a need is being demonstrated to and have a fixed timeline actually to migrate them to the GST regime, it will bring a lot of clarity for the entire value chain. The second important thing also that you need to, that's on the operational efficiency side of it, because all these product categories are today facing issues. Now, the second part of it is, which I'm just drawing extension from what was being spoken just before this, and you spoke about rationalization of taxes. We will also need to decide on newer technologies where India is establishing itself for the first time. Where are we going to place them in the tax regime, given that we want, or we have targets of taking manufacturing as a percentage of GDP to a particular level. We also want to establish these value chains because we want to have lesser imports. Classic example is electric vehicles and batteries which are going to be used in electric vehicles. Today, we are trying to establish an ecosystem where we manufacture the batteries in India, and the PLI scheme is enabling that to a certain extent. What are the GST rates at which you would want to keep these newer technologies where you want to establish India as a use case from a manufacturing competitiveness standpoint is also going to be very, very important. So certain directional clarity also on this, while implementation may be over a period of 2 to 3 years, but if there is a directional clarity also provided, I think visibility to international investors, stakeholders will improve significantly and will build confidence in the system.
Okay.
I think a very, very important point. When I
Absolutely.
meant ideologically in terms of the GST rate, architecture, we have to look at the India growth story and what is driving it. So these
Right.
leverage sectors have to be given some incentives in terms of comparing them with other areas. Finally, before we wrap up, I think I have a question. If we still have time for Mr. Garg, Mr. Garg, are you there?
Yes.
Yeah, there are, as we reimagine GST, post 2024 elections, results, there is a formula doing the rounds. So I just wanted your view on that, stabilizing the overall rate at 14%, 6% for the center, 6% for states, and 2% straight to civic administrations. Is it workable, and what's your overall, perspective on this?
See, again, let me just make a comment on that ideological question, socialist kind of thing, motor vehicles and all. See, I think that debate is about 20-25 years old. Cars are no longer the socialist or the high elite kind of thing. It has become mainstream. A lot of people need to use it. The debate today is the internal combustion engine versus EV, electric vehicles.
I was giving reference to it, Mr. Garg. Mr. Bhargav recently, at the start of the year, made this huge statement that if India has to do a catch-up with China in terms of car density and car penetration, which is much more than India currently, we need to bring about taxes by the half. So in that context, my
I'm just coming to that. So the EVs are taxed 5%. They are at the lower rate. So in future, this is a growing segment which is already taxed at a very low rate.
Fair point.
So don't worry too much about the ICE vehicle taxation. This is a passing thing. Now to come back to this 14%, these kind of thing. You remember when the GST was brought in, an exercise was done, revenue neutral rate, 15%. I'm not aware of any recent study which brings about what is the revenue neutral rate today. And the fast change which is happening about the composition of the value add in the form of goods and the services, and the likely changes in this output composition for future, unless a very careful study is done about this, I think going into a single rate, 14% or something, may again be missing the target quite a lot either way, most likely on the downward way. So I wouldn't advise any such adventure or misadventure at this point.
Mr. Garg, before we let you go, finally in the next June meeting, any agenda items that you would like to discuss them and take a view on quickly?
This is more of a form. And if they can't solve the gaming issue, which is burning for quite some time, then what else can you expect there?
Interesting.
So I don't think there is much coming out of this, and one doesn't see the enthusiasm or agenda flying around or discussions taking place in the ministers' meeting or group so far. So
I'm tempted to ask you this, Mr. Garg. You've been in the government and you worked with Mr. Jaitley. I think you worked with the current finance minister as well. I mean, is it good or bad that an entire reform is linked to a personality? With due respect to all the relevant resources. I think, some people have been telling me that we are missing the personality that could gravitate and put people together. But shouldn't reform happen on their own?
And where does that bring the question of, cooperative federalism,
Absolutely.
if it's just one person driving the entire agenda?
I don't think this is as simple as that, and it's not good to discuss personalities. What I would rather discuss is the number one, the approach, a consensual approach, or I am the boss and you are not equal kind of thing. Those two approaches may be different, but to me, more impact these days is about what I talked about, the overall regime of fiscal federal relationship, shifting to a fiscal unionism. I spoke about the loans, borrowing powers, this one, sharing of taxes, excise duty. So it's not a simpler, I don't think all of these is driven by Mrs. Nirmala Sitharaman. So it will not be fair to put all what is happening at her doors.
Completely agree with you. We need to divorce it from the personality, Carl. When you begin a new idea, then you need a driver through a personality that Mr. Jaitley did. That's why I'm saying, post that, it should have its own momentum, it should have its own, everybody is an equal stakeholder in that sense. At least on paper, everybody is a stakeholder. So they must collectively drive. That was the whole idea of defining GST as a federal India success story, as a team India success story. I do guess post-elections, they'll get back and, sit together and get into a huddle and sort out the pending issues and make GST a rolling and rollicking star as it is.
Before we let our panel go, a final question there for Hetal as well. Hetal, we've briefly touched on and not perhaps broadly discussed the leakages with GST, and in fact, Mr. Modi also talked about how leakages is an important concern with GST. What, in your understanding, can we do to tap these leakages or plug these leakages and frauds that, and some of the big numbers there mentioned, Maharashtra for that matter, Mr. Modi said, and I'm attributing these figures to him, saying that there were frauds worth 60,000 crore in last 1 year. Big numbers there, but how do you really work around these numbers? What do you do to ensure the frauds or leakages are not happening?
Yeah, so I think simpler digital solutions is the only way that leakages can be garnered. And I think India has set an example in terms of even stopping leakages or preventing leakages at B2C level. If you ask me, one of the biggest success stories over there has been toll collections in the country, and how we are placed over there today. If we can make that possible, and if we can make UPI possible, a more simpler way of monitoring can simply make things easier, and integration. And the integration is at a state level, which means the RTOs, the state constituencies and the central combined together. If there is an integration of the systems, I do believe that it will help a lot in terms of ensuring that leakages are arrested.
All right, Hetal, Subhash Chandra Garg, thanks very much for joining with your inputs on that very, very important story. We're going to shift focus for now. Breaking news coming in there. CBI has conducted searches at 7 locations in Mumbai. The search locations are that of Chairman Naresh Goyal, Jet Airways former Chairman Naresh Goyal, in an alleged bank fraud case amounting to 538 crore rupees. We are told that his wife and other accused in the cases are also being searched, and their locations are currently being searched. Remember, this comes as a fresh blow for Naresh Goyal, who is already reeling under the loss of his CEO designate position, Rakesh, at Jet Airways. Jet Airways not reviving there, but it looks like CBI is now cracking down on Naresh Goyal.
Well, I mean, Mr. Naresh Goyal has been under the shadow for quite some time. He's, been being probed for his role at Jet Airways and few other financial alleged irregularities.
Okay.
But it shows that the air turbulence ghost is now also catching up with people who've been running airlines. So in that sense, there are problems, and the problem with most of the airline companies is that their relationship with the banks and their ability or inability to pay up and take that is also turned into a big NPA. So I guess in case of Jet, the debt would be a challenge, and inability to service that debt, we don't have the full details yet.
Absolutely.
Would probably be a reason for going after Mr. Goyal and his family. Okay. But it's not the first time that he's been come under the radar of these agencies. So in that sense, it could be part of an ongoing probe which has taken the next step forward.
And in fact comes just days after he resigned from his position of CEO designate for Jet Airways, also tanking the possibility of any revival for Jet Airways. We don't know where the future of Jet Airways stand at the moment.
I mean, there are challenges. As we keep saying, we're back to a monopolistic situation in the airline area. We have Indigo with about 55% market share, which will now probably increase with Go First going down, suspending its operation. So in that sense, that is 55% market share for one player, and then Air India and Tata's put together 7 and 5 or 8 or 5, 13, 14%. So in that sense, not having sufficient players to drive and cater to, in this case, not even drive, the ever-growing growth in the aviation sector, in the civil domain, is India's tragedy too, I would say, and tragedy of the aviation sector.
Absolutely, tragedy of the aviation sector. In fact, we discussed at length the tragedy of aviation sector, which is not able to have the same similar sort of momentum as it expects on paper.
Shweta, I had written a piece in 2019, and I had recalled right from East West Airlines, which was the first private airline. In early 90s, India opened up what we call the open sky policy, which enabled entry of private airlines, and East West Airline was the first, airline in that space. It held a lot of promise. Unfortunately, again, the same problem with the bankers, credit, debit, and then, rivalry. Unfortunately, the promoter was killed in Bombay. He was assassinated. And its own financial woes, and then the woes of the promoters and that assassination, put a lid on East West Airline.
Right.
And then Modi left, somehow, as and when there is a potential of the skies really brightening up, with many more players coming in and catering to the growth that has happened post-pandemic, as we imagine and we keep repeating at our show that India's civil aviation growth story is really sitting on a huge potential piece. But are there enough players? Is there enough support from the ecosystem to partake of that story? In that sense, yet another setback, if what we are hearing is right.
Okay. What we are hearing, and I'll repeat that for the sake of our audience right now, what we are hearing is that searches have been conducted at the house of former CEO designate of Jet Airways, Naresh Goyal, and his wife in a scam amounting to about 500 crore rupees. Remember, he is the, he was the CEO designate of Jet Airways just before he resigned about a couple of days ago.
Is this an agency report?
It is an agency report. We're attributing it to sources at this point in time. Remember, Jet Airways, once the largest private carrier, suspended its operations back in 2019 due to severe cash crunch.
In fact, when there was talk of Jet Airways reviving itself, we were all very happy that an airline which sort of say dominated the skies, the blue and the red combination, was really shaping up well. But even, if that is not happening afresh with these challenges, bad news for Indian aviation.
Absolutely. The airline was in fact taken over by Jalan Khar Consortium in 2021.
A lot of promises again, but
promises made, but not really met.
A deferred timeline repeatedly.
Okay.
And so essentially we are boiling down back to Indigo and the combined Air India, Vistara, Tata, SIA and Air Asia being brought back into the Air India fold. So just two players, one big player which is a combination of so many 3-4 airlines run by Tatas and Indigo. SpiceJet is there, but not too sure about how the Go First story pans out and what happens to the idea and the hope that Jet would get revived.
Absolutely. Let me just wrap that up for our audience at this point in time. CBI has conducted searches at 7 locations in Mumbai. The search was at the home and location of Naresh Goyal in an alleged bank fraud case amounting to 538 crore rupees. His wife Vanitha Goyal and other accused are also being searched at. These are, of course, inputs coming in from our sources at this point in time. These are not reports. That this is a breaking news.
Right away.
This is a breaking news coming in at this point in time, and we are attributing these fresh developments to sources. Remember, Naresh Goyal already reeling under a lot of pressure. He resigned as the CEO designate of Jet Airways. Jet Airways, the domestic carrier that went under in 2019 due to severe financial crunch. Pressure there mounting and troubles there mounting for Naresh Goyal and his family. We will continue to track that very important stories and more. Keep watching News 9.